True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
6-year-old Sheree Beasley was a tough little cookie. She'd been through a lot in her short life, but she had a real love of life and an independent streak. Sheree loved her bicycle and was always happy for any excuse to take it out for a spin. Sheree had survived her baby brother, who died of SIDS, followed by the fatal drug overdose of her stepfather. She lived with her mom and her younger siblings. Sheree's mom struggled in life and tried to give her the best life that she could. But through it all, Sheree wore a wide, beautiful smile. She was a joyful little girl with some street smarts. But her independence and lack of supervision made her a target, and she was abducted by a lurking predator. When Sheree's bike was found abandoned, her mother knew that Sheree had been taken. Her heart broke with the loss of a second child. It was unbearable and unfair, she felt, for her to suffer twice. Sheree's abductor wasn't known to her family, but he had been seen near the schools and the public swimming pool, exposing himself and approaching young children. His therapist was aware that he was a threat. How much his wife knew is debatable. We'll talk about that. At the Quiet End today, we're talking about the vibrant life of Australian child Sheree Beasley, her joys and her difficulties. Her loss brings us to the topics of child safety, how we deal with child sexual predators, and the dynamics of the patient-therapist privilege. For instance, when is it appropriate for a therapist to alert police of a client who's a danger? This episode, The Life and Loss of Sheree Beasley, is dedicated to every child who's been lost to a predator. We hope Sheree's story will help us to share some constructive dialogue on this topic. Dick's going to lighten things up for just a few seconds with an excellent beer review before we get started.
So the last time, or maybe the time before last, that we did an Australian case, and I did Foster's Lager as my Australian beer. And I was taken to task by quite a few Aussies who said that that wasn't representative of their beers.
And I think we knew that.
We did.
Yeah.
I was looking mainly at beers that the United States people feel is emblematic of Australia. But this time, at the suggestion of several people, I have a true Australian beer that's even well-liked. This is Victoria Bitter. It's brewed by Carlton and United Breweries in South Bank, Australia. Now, it's an American adjunct lager, which means it's kind of like a Budweiser with corn and other adjuncts. But it's not too bad. So it's...
A rave review.
I know. It's a gold color with a puffy white head, has a sweet malt biscuity type of aroma, and a sweet biscuit taste. It's a very light-bodied beer. Now you notice I'm kind of sparse with the words here, because there isn't too much to say about this.
Okay, so it's a simple beer.
It's a simple beer. It's a very good beer to drink after you've mowed the lawn. We've talked about lawnmower beers before.
Yes, we have.
So it's a thirst quencher.
Well, I thought it was supposed to at least be tastier than Foster's.
It is.
Okay.
But it's not, at the same token, a great beer. It's a decent beer.
Okay, fair enough. Let's open it up and then we'll head down to the Quiet End.
Okay.
Okay, here we are.
Yeah, I see our new buddy is here. He was very informative the last time we were here. He was giving us some great tales of the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton.
Yeah, I like to refer to him as the Google guy because he Googles things and just hands out facts to people at the bar as a way to start conversation, which is really quite brilliant. It works.
It did. And he was a good conversationalist. Fun to talk with.
Yeah. Do we have enough of those beers to share with him?
We do.
Awesome.
So let's get started.
Okay.
Okay. Kerry Greenhill was just 17 years old when she fell in love with Anthony Mandel. He was just a few months older, tall and good-looking. Carrie became pregnant right away, and the couple got married in her uncle's backyard. Sheree Joy Mandel was born on February 25, 1985, 11 days late for her Valentine's due date. Now, to her mom, Carrie, she was a perfect baby. Carrie was overwhelmed with how much she loved her new baby. She really was a beautiful kid. We read that she entered Sheree in beautiful baby contests, and she won 3 trophies and a bunch of ribbons. And at the same time, Sheree was an easy baby who slept through the night when she was only 2 weeks old.
Yeah, when she was 1 year old, Carrie and Anthony were working full-time, and Anthony's mother, Jill, watched Sheree during the day. After a few months, Carrie said she missed her daughter too much, though, and she decided to stay home. She started taking Sheree to a playgroup during the day, but they were asked to stop coming because Sheree was too fidgety and disruptive. So she was making up for her babyhood, being pretty rambunctious as she got older.
Yeah, I guess she was a pretty boisterous toddler.
Yes. Anthony and Carrie had a second daughter, Crystal, in 1987, but it was only a short time after her birth that the couple broke up. Carrie moved to Waterloo Place, Mornington, and enrolled Sheree in 3-year-old kindergarten. Sheree was a standout, very extroverted, and just an outspoken little girl. At home, she danced for her parents and grandparents. She sang Carly Simon's "You're So Vain," but she called it "Clouds in My Coffee."
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
It does, absolutely. It's the best line, I think. She also knew all the words to American Pie, and she loved to perform with her plastic microphone, one of her favorite toys.
A born entertainer. Now, when Sheree was just 4 years old, she learned to ride a bike without training wheels. She loved to ride that bike. Carrie began seeing a troubled young man named Sheree Beasley around this same time, and they got married, and Carrie and her daughters took Shane's last name. Did they get married?
I'm not sure, but they did take his name, so I'm thinking they probably did.
Yeah. Now, Shane was deeply involved in drugs, regularly using Rohypnol, the date rape drug, and heroin.
Now, see, I didn't think that people took Rohypnol for themselves. Doesn't it just make you pass out?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it doesn't sound like a fun drug.
I don't think you get a real high from it, do you?
I wouldn't think so, but I don't know.
Not like heroin, but heroin's similar. I mean, you get a high from heroin, but pretty snoozy and drowsy.
That's true, but I think Rohypnol, you just kind of pass out and then you don't remember anything. So what kind of fun is that?
Maybe that's what the point is.
Yeah, maybe just didn't want to deal with life, which I think heroin's probably something people turn to for that reason as well.
Yes.
But anyway, there were problems in the beginning with Shane.
Yeah, this was not a good relationship, actually, from the beginning.
Sheree was home to witness when Shane was dragged in by friends after repeatedly overdosing on drugs. Carrie called ambulances to come to their home, where the paramedics would use Narcan to jolt him awake. He was hospitalized more than once. And then Carrie had her own health problems. I'm not sure what they were, but I know that she was hospitalized for a time. And the Department of Health and Community Services intervened. So they put Sheree in the custody of her grandfather, Neil, and Crystal, the younger daughter, into the care of their maternal grandmother, Marie.
Yeah, now, Carrie's parents aren't together. They had divorced a long time ago, but they each had one of the granddaughters.
Mm-hmm. And Neil, at least, had remarried.
Yeah. Grandpa Neil would always cherish the 8 months he and his wife Denise spent with Sheree. He always had regrets about not being more involved in Carrie's childhood. He was only 18 when Carrie was born, and he really didn't know how to cope with being a dad. Now, at this point, he felt lucky to have a chance to care for his daughter's child. He felt like Sheree was very much like her mother in so many ways. Now, after 8 months, Carrie got well enough to take back her daughters. It didn't take her long to get pregnant again in 1989, and she had another daughter she named Jacinta. Sheree was still little herself, but she doted over Jacinta like she was her mother. She was wise beyond her years, and she loved to take care of her younger siblings.
Yeah, it sounds like she really did. She started primary school at Frankston's Monterey Primary School in 1990. On her first day, the family's German Shepherd followed her to school and waited for her outside the whole day. Being a big kid in a big kid school made Sheree believe she was a grown-up now, and she insisted on making her own lunches and getting ready on her own. And there was a story that Carrie would tell about how Sheree wanted to be ready for school all week and made all the lunches at once.
Right.
But then by Friday, it was all stale.
Yeah.
Yeah. Paternal grandparents Jill and Anthony Sr. saw the girls on most weekends. They'd pick them up on Friday afternoon and drop them off on Sunday. They liked to take the girls hiking, visiting relatives, and to the playground. They watched videos, and Jill would make them their favorite snacks. Wherever they went, people stopped and smiled at Sheree's happy, outgoing personality. She loved the movie E.T., and she believed it was a true story. And she also loved to watch the Disney classics. There was a lot of stress and difficulty in the life of Sheree's mom, but Sheree just seemed very resilient, which most kids are, right?
It's amazing how resilient kids are.
They just adapt.
Now, Carrie got pregnant again, and once again she and Shane were separating. They were arguing all the time about his drug use. Now, Carrie wanted a normal family life for herself and her children, but Shane couldn't stop using drugs. And after several loud fights, Carrie got a restraining order to keep him away from her and the kids.
Carrie gave birth to their first son in February of 1990, and they named him Shane Jr. Now, Sheree was delighted to have another new baby in the house, especially the first baby brother. She was always the first one out of bed in the morning, and she would run in her mom's room and check on him in his bassinet and change his diaper, do whatever needed to be done. But 10 weeks after Shane was born, Sheree checked on Shane in the morning, and he wouldn't wake up. It was after 8 a.m. Now, he usually woke up at 6 a.m. crying for a bottle. Carrie jumped up in a panic when Sheree told her he wouldn't wake up, and she found her baby was not breathing. Sheree probably didn't completely understand what was happening, but she knew it was bad, and she ran outside screaming and crying up and down the block. So that had to be terribly traumatic.
No kidding. And then what followed was even maybe worse. Carrie took Sheree to her little brother's funeral because she thought it was best to let her grieve with the adults. There was still enough fog over the baby's death when Shane Sr. died after a fatal drug overdose.
Yeah.
So she's lost her baby brother and her stepfather.
Right.
Within a few days of each other.
I know, it's horrible. It's just a really rough life that was going on there. By mid-1990, Carrie had another man in her life, though. Steve Ludlow. He moved in with them within weeks of meeting Carrie, so she moved kind of fast. They met at a local bar, and Steve was 4 years younger than she was. She hoped that things were going to work out this time, but deep down, she always had this feeling that she was just doomed to have a rough life. Sheree became even more independent. She showered and dressed herself. At school, she'd made her own club of girls that would do activities, and she organized everything. She would rush home from school each day, drop her backpack, and take off to ride her bicycle. She bossed around her little sister Crystal and tried to show her how to do things for herself. But if you look at the family photos, Sheree's always posed with a wide grin.
She was. Now, Carrie, Steve, and the girls moved from their rental place on Frankston to a bigger place in Rosebud, just a small coastal town. Their new house was on a dirt road off Nepean Highway, which links the affluent Portsea area in Melbourne to the north. Rosebud apparently is a popular holiday spot, and it was filled with tourists and day trippers in the summer. To Carrie, this was ideal for the family, and she had hopes for a good, quiet family life with no drugs. The in-laws lived in Rosebud, so she had some more support from them.
Sheree loved her new school. That was Rosebud Primary. She got a new bike, a pink Roadmaster from Santa Claus. Her school teacher, Jill Young, had seen her out riding when it was nearly dark one day, and she was very concerned. About 5 p.m. one afternoon, she asked Sheree why she was riding around at the abandoned schoolyard, and Sheree told the teacher that her mom knew where she was and she was having fun, so it was okay. But the teacher said, "Well, no, it's not okay. It's not safe. You need to ride your bike straight home." And there were a few stories from neighbors and teachers that had this concern with Sheree being out on her own too much.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, to me there's an undertone of maybe Sheree didn't want to be home. She knew how tough it was at home, so she was always out on her bike.
Wow, that's very insightful, Dick. That hadn't occurred to me, but I think you might be right.
I don't know how insightful it is. I'm just That's the sense I get from reading, is that her mom was trying hard, but I think Mom was kind of marginal in the sense that she wasn't sure how to parent.
I think so, and I think there was the whole factor of choosing the wrong men. Although I don't know, Steve might have been a fine man. I'm not sure about that. But I think that she obviously had a tendency to rush into these relationships.
Yes, it seems like that. I mean, this kid is 5 or 6 years old, Sheree, and Mom's on her third guy.
Yes. So that's a lot for her to deal with. But, if you were to look back at Carrie's upbringing, you'd understand that she had it quite rough, too. And these kinds of things, as I'm sure you know, they can go from generation to generation.
Sure.
So
you do what you've learned to do.
Exactly. And her parents weren't together, and there was a lot of instability, so I'm sure that it was hard for her to find her way.
I'm positive it was.
Yes. But, yeah, I think she really did try. Sheree began dance classes at Stage Door Dance Academy in Rosebud, and she just knew that she was going to be a famous dancer when she grew up. She would tell people that.
And now, in June, a man was spotted near the dance school, apparently asking children to get in his car. Now, the dance school owners told the children to be careful. One teacher was especially concerned about Sheree, who came to her classes alone on her bike. Geez, I just look at this and I'm thinking maybe you should call the police if you've got some strange person lurking around your dance class.
Well, they
asking
might have.
kids to get into his car.
They might have called the police. We know that this predator people did call in about him in many locations time and time again, and he just kept repeat offending, at least with the indecent exposure. We'll get into the background of the predator.
Yeah, we will. And apparently back in March, 3 months before the dance school incidents, the same man who was later seen hanging around the dance school was seen at a public swimming pool fondling himself and talking to a group of boys. I'm waiting to meet some girls, he told them. They're coming on the bus. I'm going to have sex with them.
And he said other more profane things, which I'm just not going to mention, but you can get the idea.
So one of the boys told a teacher, who ran outside in time to see Robert Lowe run to his little blue Toyota Corolla. And the teacher got the license plate number, and the car was traced to this traveling salesman. Now, he admitted to police that he'd been in the vicinity, but he was only resting in his car. Now, police warned him to stay away from the children, and no charges were filed. Now, what police didn't realize is that this was all a sick game to Robert Lowe. He got more and more excited by the exposure, and his behavior was slowly escalating.
Yes, so this is just a dangerous situation. So let's talk a little bit about who this monster was. Robert Lowe, he was a married family man and a church elder. He met his wife Lorraine back in the early 70s, and they married after 2 years of off-and-on dating. So if you compare this to Carrie's relationships, it's just kind of interesting, I think, because he was much older when he got married. They dated a lot longer. You'd think that would be the better relationship, but you're going to find out it's probably more dysfunctional than Carrie's relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, this guy wasn't wired right.
No. His father was a wealthy accountant, but he died when Robert was young. Robert had a privileged background, and he went to expensive boarding schools. As a teen, Robert liked school and did very well. He trained at the Melbourne School of Textiles and got a job with Dunlop DuPont. Lorraine married Robert in 1972, and she was 32, he was 35. In 74, they had their first son. Now their life together seemed good, but there were strange events that occasionally made Lorraine doubt if she really knew her husband. And unfortunately, she just never acted on her doubts. She pushed them aside like many of us are prone to do.
She did, and she was willing to accept his explanations.
She accepted some far-fetched explanations, though, time and time again. So
yes, she did.
I'm not going to blame anyone else for his behavior. I'm not going to blame her or the therapist or Sheree's mom for maybe being negligent because, of course, he's the monster that hurt her. But I do think Lorraine was in some kind of denial here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, for example, one night in the early 1970s, Robert was late coming home for dinner, and a neighbor came to the door to tell Lorraine that Robert was on the phone. Now, Robert had refused to get a phone in his own home because there's a public phone just down the street.
It's a little weird.
That's weird.
Yeah.
So Robert asked Lorraine to grab some identification to take a taxi to the police station because the police didn't believe that Robert had a wife and son. Now, this worked. He left the police station with Lorraine and their son, looking confident and amused. Back home over dinner, he told Lorraine that they had been looking for someone else, so no worries. Robert's story was that he had been talking to a woman who had second thoughts about talking to a stranger and took down his license plate number and called police. He said that was all there was to it. Now, that's kind of unbelievable, but anyway, she accepted that. He was a salesman and an extrovert, so he was always chatting up strangers. And many strange things like this took place over the years, and each time Lorraine pushed them to the back of her mind.
Yeah, so we'll get into many more things. I just want to take a quick break here to talk about our sponsor. Now, if you're a fan of True Crime Brewery, you probably enjoy mysteries. I'm just going to talk for a minute about a new podcast I discovered called Unexplained Mysteries. If you're a little bit older, over 30, you might remember that TV show called Unsolved Mysteries. This is like that, but only better. It's really fascinating to listen to, and I've been popping it on before I go to sleep at night. Some of the topics are things I thought I knew all about, but I always learn something new and interesting when I listen to this. From how Stonehenge was built to who was the subject for the Mona Lisa, Unexplained Mysteries picks some things that you think are simple or straightforward or, well, yeah, I know all about that. But it digs deep into it, investigates it, and it's really fascinating. What I really enjoy also about Unexplained Mysteries is the way they use really captivating storytelling and kind of take you along on their journey as they do the research. There's real analysis as they look for answers, and you feel like you're going along for a fun ride. You can check out these episodes on Mona Lisa and Stonehenge right now, and new episodes come out every Thursday. Some upcoming topics are crop circles and dragons, so that sounds like good stuff.
It does, especially dragons.
Right. Visit Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you're listening to True Crime Brewery, and search for Unexplained Mysteries. That's UNEXPLAINED MYSTERIES. You can also find it at parcast.com/unexplained to start listening now. Well, maybe not right now, but after this episode you could start. So that's PARCAST, parcast.com/unexplained to listen to Unexplained Mysteries.
So getting back to the story of Robert Lowe and his family, they had another son in 1976. Then in 1979 they moved to Glen Waverly. This new house was newly built with 4 bedrooms and a very beautiful manicured lawn. Now in 1984, Robert asked Lorraine out of the blue to come to the courthouse with him. This time he told her he had been wrongfully accused of something, and the court needed to see that they were a respectable family. So Lorraine's confused. She met with Robert and his lawyer, and she was relieved when the lawyer said the whole thing was vigorously denied. Robert was completely innocent, he told her.
Yeah, well, what had happened, there were 2 girls. They were both about 12, and they testified against him, but they were unable to identify him in court. They cried and said they couldn't give any details of what had been done to them. So it sounds like they weren't really interrogated by a professional therapist or someone who knew how to talk to young people about these types of things. But Robert's lawyer pointed to Lorraine in the courtroom, saying that she was Robert's ill wife that was on medication, and that it was just a disgrace that Robert and his family had been put through such an ordeal. Lorraine, when she heard this in the courtroom, was really upset. So after they got out of court, she stormed off home. And then Robert came home later, and he told her the whole thing was a lie by the 12-year-olds, and it was all over, and she shouldn't worry about it. Now this time she didn't believe him so easily. She said she wanted to know what he was doing to get in trouble, and she wanted him to stop it because this is happening over and over again.
It's not the first time,
No.
or the second or third.
No. Over and over, and she doesn't even know the half of it.
Right.
He told her that he was being harassed and the police were liars who were out to get him because he was a friendly Christian family man. He told her to never trust the police. He said he had a bit of a problem, that he needed to talk to people, and it was drawing the attention of the police. Then he denied committing any crime or being unfaithful to her. So I don't know why she would believe that the police are going to go after someone for being friendly.
Exactly.
So that's where I have to think Lorraine really didn't want to find out what the truth was at this point.
No, as you said, she was in denial.
Yeah, and really determined to make her marriage work.
She was. Now, she knew she'd led a sheltered life, which we read a little bit about her early life. She was brought up by these really strict fundamentalist people that were involved in some kind of cult. And she broke loose from them when she was, like 18 or 20 years old. But she wasn't allowed to do hardly anything as a child and teenager.
No TV, no music.
Yeah, so she was incredibly naive when she first struck out on her own.
I know, but she didn't marry until she was 32. She must have had some adult experiences.
Yeah, she did.
So.
Now, Robert, meanwhile, is telling Lorraine that it's normal, that most people have brushes with the law. Well, I don't know. Have you?
No.
Me either. So they're 100% on this end. Now, he promised that there was nothing to be worried about. Lorraine believed her husband, and she did develop a dislike and suspicion of police.
Yeah, so she's kind of on his side here.
She's buying into this.
She is.
Now, by 1990, Robert was working for a small rag trade firm in Melbourne. His job was to sell beads, pearls, and other things to retailers who sold fabrics. He was a very good salesman. He had the gift. And he made a good living. He paid off their house.
Well, and he must have been really good because most of the time he was supposed to be working, he was out following children around.
Right.
And fondling himself in public. So he must have made a lot of sales in a short period of time.
Yeah, he was good. Because the truth was, as you said, he'd been arrested numerous times for fondling himself in front of children and young women. All this he kept a secret from Lorraine. Oh, he called her every day to keep her from trying to call him at work, just because he changed jobs with such frequency after being arrested.
Yeah. And I guess most of the companies didn't have anything bad to say about him and didn't call the police. They just kind of quietly got rid of him, which isn't helping society at all either. So I'm not real happy about that either.
Well,
it's not a good way to handle this.
It's not an excuse, but that's how it was back then.
Yeah. And it still is in some ways today.
To a degree.
The woman who would become Robert's psychotherapist and have a pretty big role in his trial was Margaret Hobbs. She was known as a lay expert in compulsive disorders, and she specialized in working with men who were repeat sex offenders. She started out as a probation and parole officer with the Victorian Mental Health Authority. She dealt with exhibitionists, pedophiles, and rapists. She moved to private outpatient therapy and built quite a reputation as the woman to seek out for treatment for willful and obscene exposure and other compulsive behavioral disorders. The men she saw had often been abused in their childhood and became fixated at some sexual level which they never matured from. They were usually very aggressive and they lacked any sense of responsibility. Many were very religious and had grown up without a father. Just of note, Robert's father died when he was 8, and his mother did remarry, but Robert spent most of his time away in boarding schools. Most of the men that Margaret saw were looking for some sort of response to their behavior, she said, to reassure them that they were men. Now, they wouldn't get the response they wanted because most people are going to run away from that, so they just keep doing it. It was very narcissistic behavior, which Margaret saw as misdirected anger.
Yeah, so Robert Lowe came into Margaret's office in 1984 when he had a court case pending. She saw him several times before she wrote a report for his court appearance. In the report she wrote, "His behavioral problem is a chronic one, having been established over some 15 years, and has been strengthened and conditioned by non-detection. He has not been afforded the opportunity of treatment due to this non-detection and continuing mistaken beliefs. He expresses great relief that he has finally been caught."
Yeah, so at this point, she's thinking he wants to change, and she's trying to help him.
She is. But, you know, I think even in the 80s, people knew that there wasn't much of a cure for this.
Well, I think some of the men she saw who only exposed themselves, they were like flashers, she did have some success with them.
Possibly.
But he was much different. He was actually escalating and trying to get kids in his car, and that's different. That's different than what the flashers were doing for the most part, from what I read of her notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So at the court hearing, the charge was marked as withdrawn, and Robert was given a $500 12-month good behavior bond for willful and obscene exposure with the condition that he continue therapy with Margaret Hobbs. So he got off pretty easily. $500 fine?
He got off easily time and time again. Now Lorraine, his wife, went once with Robert to see Margaret, who told her that Robert was an exhibitionist. Now, she didn't have any clue. He hadn't told her anything. She had hopes that Robert would change, but the more Margaret saw Robert, the more she realized that he had no remorse, he had no anxiety about his crimes. So she asked him as an exercise to keep a log of what he did each day. After reading it, she was extremely concerned. He had regular spots he frequented, public bathrooms, beaches, primary schools, public pools, anywhere that there were little girls and sometimes little boys. So she talked to him about how his victims might feel, to try and get some empathy and get him to think about that, but he didn't show any empathy. She even tried talking about his own children and how would he feel if it happened to them, and he actually shrugged.
Right.
Yeah.
So he was a different duck from most exhibitionists because he didn't keep a distance.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah, he tried to get as close as he could. He tried to get children into his car, and he made continuing lewd remarks. And while this was going on, his behavior was becoming bolder, and his targets were getting younger. So gradually over time, Margaret realized that Robert wasn't trying to get well. His psychotherapy was apparently another way for him to expose himself, this time verbally. He rationalized that his victims were culpable because they were in places where he could access them. Now that's some rationalization, isn't it?
That is crazy rationalization. So let's talk about what he's doing going to Margaret. He's pretty much just trying to get off on seeing her. It's like another form of using a person for his own gratification, because he's having fun with this. He likes to talk to her about it, which I've heard before with serial killers. They like to talk about what they did and kind of relive it. So that's really creepy to me.
It certainly is. So Robert saw Margaret only sporadically between 1988 and 1990. In April of 1990, he returned to Margaret. This time the police had gone to his employer about an alleged attempted child abduction. So this is, like you said, escalating.
Yeah, and he only goes for help when he thinks it's going to help him with a court case.
Right.
Yeah.
Now this was a little girl of only about 5 who had been with 2 other girls as Robert followed her. This time he lost his job. Then after this incident with the 5-year-old, a few weeks later he was involved in an incident with 2 10-year-old girls. So Margaret began to believe that Robert needed to be punished with imprisonment so he could see that his behavior was unacceptable. But she didn't consider reporting him to the police because she would never breach the confidence with a client. She just hoped that
It's a hard word.
She just hoped that the judicial system would get tough with him.
Now, after finding an attorney's bill in their mailbox, Lorraine contacted Margaret herself, and she agreed to come with Robert for a session. Margaret was hoping that Lorraine's involvement would force Robert to see what he's doing and change his behavior. In front of Robert, Lorraine nervously asked him to stop his disgusting behavior. So she was very kind of a beaten-down woman, shaking. Just to speak up to him was hard for her. And his answer was very matter-of-fact and even cruel, I'd say, because he said, "I choose not to." So that's pretty much a fuck you statement.
Sure is.
Robert smiled, and Margaret was just stunned when she saw how he was talking to his wife like that. Lorraine ran out of the office. Margaret knew that Lorraine wasn't aware of the scope of Robert's crime, so she called her at home. Margaret ended up telling Lorraine that she needed to divorce Robert or she was going to be sorry. But Lorraine didn't do it.
So Margaret won't go to the authorities with what she knows about Robert, but she has no compunction about calling his wife and telling her everything.
Well, he's already invited the wife in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know. I mean, I think if you bring someone into your therapy, maybe you're giving permission to share some things. I'm not sure, but we're going to go over on the rules and all that.
We are,
Yeah.
yes.
So Margaret threw Robert out of therapy when he told her he was going to plead not guilty to his offenses against the 10-year-old girls. She said, "Robert, I can't support this behavior," and she told him she did not want to see him again. So if you're kicking him out of therapy, this might have been a point where maybe she could have told the authorities, I think.
Possibly. Although the fact that she kicked him out of therapy doesn't mean, at least in her mind, that there's still a therapist-client relationship.
Yeah. On the morning of June 29th, 1991, Sheree Beasley jumped out of bed, eager to start her day. Robert Lowe was praying at the home of his fellow worshipers at 7:45 a.m.
Yeah, that's how he started his days. He would go to someone's house and pray with them.
Yes. At 8 a.m., Sheree asked her mom if she could go ride her bike to the Lighthouse Milk Bar, but Carrie said no. So Milk Bar is like a corner store. We determined that with another case, I think. By 10 a.m., Sheree got her mom to finally let her go. She was buying bread for her mom and some candy for herself. Then she rode back home and had lunch with her mom and sisters. In the afternoon, she got bored, and she went for a ride down Parkmore Road toward the highway. Robert had breakfast with friends and told them he was going into Rosebud to fix some tiles in their holiday flat. He left those friends at around 11 a.m. Now, we should say that Robert had seen Sheree before. He'd seen her several times biking in the area. And she was kind of a known entity in the area riding her bike, because she was always out riding her bike.
Always out with her bike. Yeah, she was definitely known to people.
Yes. At 1 p.m., Sheree was back home again. She wanted to go out and buy more candy, and Carrie gave in again and asked her to run an errand while she was out. So this girl has a lot of independence. She actually went to a store to pick up a dress or something, and then she had a list to go to the grocery store, and she had $20. And then her mom said there'd be $1 left over for her to get herself a treat. So while Carrie's talking to her daughter, a local handyman was driving down that highway. As he drove past Parkmore Road, he saw a blue car parked next to two phone boxes, about 20 meters from the highway. He didn't see the driver, though. Sheree did one of her mom's errands, but then she forgot to go back to the milk bar, so she went home and left home again. So it was about 1:50 p.m. when she left her house for the last time. A few minutes after 2 p.m., Sheree left the Lighthouse Milk Bar with all the things that she had to buy for her mom on the list, plus some goodies.
Goodies for Sheree. Meanwhile, there's a family named Henley who was driving along the highway when they noticed a car driving toward them on the other side of the road. Mrs. Henley saw a little girl wearing a bicycle helmet sitting in the front seat, and this little girl was visibly upset. She looked at the driver. He stared back at her, looking angrily at her, as a matter of fact. He didn't look just like an annoyed parent. He made her feel quite uncomfortable. And at the same time or so, another woman, Janine Kent, was driving on Parkmore Road, and she saw a pink child's bike lying on the road, with the front wheel still spinning. So she thought that a child might have run off to play and left it there. So she wheeled it to the side of the road and leaned it against a tree so it wouldn't get run over.
So I'm sure these women have some guilt, but there really wasn't anything different that any of us would have done.
No, not with that as it's presented.
Yeah, I know, because it's really hard to say with a kid, because they can have a fit with their parent.
That's for sure. They can.
Yeah. So she put the bike against the tree and left, and Carrie's in the kitchen, and she remarks to Steve that Sheree should be back by then. He offered to go look for her, but at first Carrie said, well, give her a few minutes. She loves to ride that bike. Minutes later, a neighbor woman knocked on their door. Now, this was a woman, one of quite a few, I think, who often kept an eye on Sheree.
Right.
The community's child.
Yeah, it takes a village.
It does. But at this point, with this one, it seems like the village failed her.
Well, I don't know. There were people looking out for her.
There were.
And not that the abduction was inevitable, but Robert had his eye on her. He was going to succeed.
He was determined, you're right. He would have waited and waited. Well, she told Carrie that Sheree's bike was left against a tree, but she couldn't find Sheree anywhere around. So Steve ran towards the road, and Steve and Carrie are immediately panicked and afraid. They know something's wrong. He sprints back and forth on the road, asking people who are walking by if they've seen a little girl, and nobody had. When he got to the bike and didn't see her, he went to a phone and called 000 on Parkmore Road and told the operator what was happening, and then he ran back home. And the police, they arrived within minutes. Steve rode back with them to the bike's location. Carrie wanted to walk to the bike and look for Sheree on the way. When she reached the bike, she just stopped and started crying, and she was just standing there crying for over half an hour. Just devastated. So the police were taking down everything Steve was telling them about Sheree in order to start a search. It's just when something like this happens, you have to be so quick.
Yeah, you do. Time, as they say, is of the essence.
Absolutely.
So there's a bulletin on the radio at 5 p.m. announcing that a 6-year-old girl was missing and believed to be abducted in Rosebud. Margaret heard it on her car radio, and she immediately thought of Robert Lowe. He could be the abductor. So crime scene investigators worked at the area where the bike was, while uniformed police and detectives knocked on the door of every nearby house. Roadblocks were set up, cars were stopped, police and volunteer helicopters hovered overhead.
Yeah, so this was a pretty intensive search.
It was, and pretty quickly organized.
So by 5 o'clock, she's been gone for 3 hours. And in most of these cases, the children are killed within hours. So by the time they get organized and get things going, it's already too late, really. It's just kind of discouraging. It's such a tough thing. It's so frustrating.
Very. Now, Robert Lowe arrived home around dusk. He went out to get takeout food for dinner and later returned. Then after dinner, Lorraine was cleaning the kitchen when she heard the washing machine start, which was quite surprising because Robert hadn't done his own laundry in 19 years.
So that's very irregular.
More than irregular.
Yeah.
So she asked Robert what he was washing, and he said he needed casual clothes for an upcoming trip. He didn't seem himself that evening, was distant and distracted. So all of Sheree's relatives came to Rosebud. The police checked local hospitals in case Sheree had been knocked off her bike and rushed to an emergency room. Sheree's home was searched and police went out on foot with dogs. Then at 11 o'clock at night, so about 9 hours after, reporters and photographers met at the Rosebud police office as Carrie asked that whoever had her daughter to take good care of her. She said that Sheree had a sad life. She lost her brother to cot death last year and deserved to be home.
On Sunday, Robert Lowe was unpacking his sales boxes from his car and cleaning his car. Lorraine saw him grab a large garden trash bag and take it to the car. He was in a terrible mood, she said, so she didn't dare question him about what he was doing. Neil Greenhill, Sheree's grandpa, was devastated by her disappearance, and he started his own search. He'd never experienced such an emotional pain before, and he had to keep going to keep from going crazy, he said. The area to search was massive, and he often felt very hopeless. And he couldn't get the image of a terrified, crying Sheree out of his head. He wondered, what am I going to do if I find her body during this search? He just didn't think he'd be able to survive that.
That would be tough, wouldn't it?
It would be awful. That's the thing, when you start looking in dumpsters and in brush, you're not looking for anything good.
No, you're not.
So on July 1st, police found a 6-year-old boy who'd been with Sheree on that day that she disappeared, and he said a man picked Sheree up off her bike and put her in his small blue car. Multiple tips came in, but they didn't pan out. On July 17th, Sue Marks and her 11-year-old daughter Danielle came forward. They'd seen a little girl in a blue car outside their motel on the Nepean Highway on the day that Sheree disappeared. Now, they hadn't called earlier because she was wearing a pink helmet, and the helmet wasn't mentioned in the news reports until recently, so they didn't make the connection. But of course, once Sue Marks realized, she was super distressed by what was going on, and she called the police immediately. Knowing now that the girl was Sheree and what she had witnessed, it was just gave her a sick feeling in her gut. She felt guilty for not coming forward earlier, but it really wasn't her fault. Now her story, chilling. It was after 2:15 p.m. that day, and her daughter Danielle was out playing on the sidewalk with her friends. Sue was sweeping the driveway and had worked her way up to the sidewalk. The traffic was moving slowly because of construction on the drains beneath the road. Traffic stopped for a few moments, and a blue car stopped directly in front of them. So this car was about 3 meters away from them. Danielle saw Sheree first. Sheree's face was screwed up near the glass as she was screaming for help. Danielle actually pointed her out to her mom, and Sue looked at Sheree. Sheree looked terrified in the passenger side of this car. The windows were up all the way, and she was clearly desperately trying to get their attention. She mouthed the words, "Help," and her eyes never left Sue's face. Then the car drove off. So now this one I think I would call somebody.
I would.
Yeah.
Jeez.
I mean,
But they didn't.
They didn't. They thought it was just a kid, with a parent or something.
Yeah, what do they think?
But if they're screaming help like that, I think I would call the police right away.
But they didn't.
No. From this story now, the police at least knew what direction the car had gone. Both Sue and Danielle independently picked an azure blue Toyota Corolla, 1985 to 1989 model, from a car lineup that the police set up. A flyer with a profile of that car was circulated and distributed to the public. It asked for the registration number of any similar car that was cited. Mail deliverers were asked to bring a form for this on their rounds, too. The detectives went to Toyota Australia for a list of the vehicles that would match this description, and there were a lot. There were 775 of them.
Yeah, but that's not a daunting number.
No, it's doable.
They can all be checked.
Yes. Blue Toyotas were stopped by police all over Melbourne, and owners were asked for their whereabouts on the day Sheree was abducted, and then every single alibi had to be checked. So this is a lot of work, a big job.
For sure. The detectives during their investigation uncovered other sex offenders, and there were multiple arrests for child pornography and child sex offenses, but nobody fitting the description of the guy who took Sheree.
No, but I mean, that is a little bit of good news.
Yeah. So on Saturday, July 20th, the Lowe family was at their holiday place in Rosebud. Benjamin, their son, who was 15, had a learner's permit, and he asked his dad to take him out driving. So as Benjamin's driving with his dad, he hears on the radio that all blue hatchback drivers needed to check in their cars with the police. He asked his father if he wanted him to drive to the police station, and Robert said, "No, don't worry about it."
Yeah, and I think at this point, even his sons were getting suspicious about him, because they're growing up and they're realizing there's something weird about Dad.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
While they're looking into suspects, a detective found a report from January of 1991 documenting a male suspect who had approached children at a public school in a blue hatchback with license number DLT771.
Yeah, but that's all the report said. But it was enough for them to look into it. A registration check showed that the car was owned by a textile company in Melbourne. Now, when they called the company, they learned that the car was driven by a family man who was a very good employee. This was Robert Lowe. His boss would say that, no, Robert couldn't have been involved in the abduction. He's a family man with 2 children. So that's very naive.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Couldn't be, my boy. He's a good guy.
Around this time, Robert went back to the therapist, Margaret Hobbs. According to her, he was very agitated and pacing when he came to see her. Lorraine had seen his attorney's bill, and he was really agitated because the attorney was Margaret's brother in a nearby office. So he threw the money that he owed her brother at Margaret, and she refused to take it, and then he stormed out. But Margaret's feeling some real suspicions about him. So she looked outside, and there was really no traffic around, and she saw Robert in a blue Toyota hatchback drive past. So this made her even more worried that he was Sheree's abductor.
Yes, so they're speaking with him because they're tracking down all these blue Toyotas. And Robert told the police that he was at home with his wife and children on the day Sheree disappeared. He apparently was quite condescending, and he seemed to be a little too sure that he hadn't been near Rosebud that day. When asked if he ever came to Rosebud at all, he said no. And the detectives became very suspicious because they had a place there.
Yeah, it was a blatant lie.
Yeah. So he asked Robert for his phone number so he'd call his wife, but Robert refused. He said it was unlisted and he didn't want to give it to him.
So that's something. If the police ask me for my number, it's the police. I'm going to give it to them.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird? I don't know. It wouldn't even occur to me to tell the police, no, you can't have my number.
I wouldn't either.
No.
And the detective wrote down notes from the conversation and immediately ran a background check, where lo and behold, he found that Robert had several prior convictions for indecent exposure and indecent assault. So Robert's now a lead suspect in this case.
Yeah, he's looking good for it, isn't he?
He's starting to.
When the detective told a colleague about this interaction with Robert, the colleague looked through some files because it was ringing a bell with him, and he found a recorded message transcript from Margaret Hobbs. The message said the caller knew a man through therapeutic dealings who had a history of sexual offenses and had a holiday house in Rosebud. She said that he had a blue hatchback and he travels for business. And she gave his name and a physical description of Robert.
So the detectives easily learned that Robert Lowe had a holiday flat in Rosebud.
Well, that wouldn't be too hard to figure out,
That's pretty
would it?
simple.
Yeah.
As police were working out a plan so that they could investigate Robert some more, he was reported at a bus station for leering at schoolgirls as he rubbed his crotch.
Well, that was his M.O.
Yeah, that's what he did.
He'd rub himself and get aroused and look at them and talk to them and then try and lure them into the car.
So he gets arrested for fondling himself and leering at the schoolgirls. And he comes into the police station.
Yep, so they talked to him again. But he'd gone and hidden his car and taken a bus back home so that they couldn't look at his car. And he was charged with obscene exposure and indecent behavior. He refused to really talk to them and was finally released on bail and got to leave again. Police did get a search warrant and went to the Lowe house when no one was home on August 2nd. They also found his work car. He'd parked it in long-term airport parking, but they weren't able to find anything suspicious in it. Remember, he cleaned it quite well the Sunday after the abduction.
He did.
They questioned Lorraine while Robert was away in Sydney, and they asked her about the day that Sheree was abducted. Now, she said she thought that Robert was home that day, and Robert had worked hard to convince her. Don't you remember? I was home. And this is kind of her life. I mean, she believes what he tells her. She kind of lets him convince her of things that she knows aren't true. She said to the police that she thought he was home. He'd been to a church meeting that morning. They had proof of that, because he actually had been. But she said they usually didn't go to Rosebud unless they spent the night. Police told Lorraine to have Robert call them when he returned from Sydney. So she called Robert that night and told him about the interview. And he told her not to talk to the police anymore. He was very agitated. He was angry that she let the police into the house. He ended up staying an extra 2 days in Sydney, too, which was curious. When he did return, he didn't call them like he said that he would, but he told Lorraine he did. And he said, oh, it was just a routine inquiry. They won't be calling us again. And she accepted that.
She did.
When Robert was finally arrested, Lorraine seemed really shocked and demanded to know what was going on. And the police told Lorraine Robert's a suspect in the Sheree Beasley abduction. But Robert did not admit to any involvement at this time. The only time he even looked a little flustered was when he was shown a photo of Sheree. But he denied ever seeing her before. Now, one thing they did find were some fibers and hairs in the vacuum cleaner. And they found a small partial palm print and fingerprint on the inside of a back bedroom door in the Lowe holiday flat. So the print was 80 centimeters from the ground, and Sheree was 110 centimeters tall.
So that fits.
That would fit, yeah. And at this point, police finally showed Lorraine all of Robert's arrest reports, and she seemed totally shocked by all this. She tried to talk to Robert about it. She still lived with him. She went home, went to bed with him.
Mm-hmm.
But he refused to talk to her about it. He said, well, if you just keep talking about the police, then there's no reason for us to even talk. And this guy was ballsy. Disgusting.
So a couple came forward as witnesses, having seen Robert in Rosebud on June 29th, and the woman had even made a note of this in her diary. Now, over 25 children had stayed in the Rosebud flat with their families in the past, Police found them all and fingerprinted them. None of these people matched the print on the back of the bedroom door. So experts examined Sheree's home and her classroom, but they didn't find any prints to compare. One of Sheree's grandmothers had a card Sheree had made for her and some toys she had played with, so she gave them to police to try and pull up some fingerprints. Lorraine ended up calling the police and telling them that she actually couldn't remember Robert being at home on the 29th of June.
So she's maybe having a realization finally?
Maybe she's coming to that determination, huh?
Yeah. In September, Robert moved out of the family home, and he was staying in the Rosebud flat, and police installed a listening device before he moved in. On September 24th, Sheree's body was found in a stormwater drain. Police had the area surrounded within minutes. She was badly decomposed, of course, but it seemed to be Sheree's size, and they were able to confirm that it was her. Of course, when they told Carrie, she had a total breakdown. She'd been crying already every day since Sheree was taken. She'd been taking sedatives and barely functioning. But this was the end. I mean, I think there's always a little ray of hope until you get the bad news. Margaret Hobbs began recording sessions and phone calls and cooperating with the investigators. Robert began talking to Margaret about being in the area when Sheree disappeared, and they talked about him making a confession to manslaughter so his wife would be able to forgive him. He eventually took Margaret to the spot where Sheree was found, and he admitted to taking her. Then his story was that she became hysterical in his car and choked to death while she was with him, so he put her body in a storm drain. Dick, I know you have some stuff you looked up on confidentiality and how this was played out in the trial. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, it's pretty interesting. Apparently, at the instigation of the police, and originally without the knowledge of the psychotherapist, a number of psychotherapy sessions and telephone conversations between Lowe and the therapist had been taped. Now, after a few months of secret taping, the police consulted the psychotherapist, and she subsequently cooperated with them. So further tapes of conversations between herself and Lowe were made with her knowledge and consent. So the defense felt that this was privileged information,
right?
Communication, and they could not use it in the trial.
But what did the prosecutor have to say about it, and what did the judge decide?
So we had a couple issues. One was confidentiality. The psychotherapist had indicated to Lowe that their discussions were confidential, but they're not.
So there's no law saying they're confidential.
The court said, in Victoria, it is clear that both common law and statute law subordinate private confidence to the wider public interest, at least when it comes to disclosing information in the interests of prosecuting serious crime and or protecting public safety. So much for confidentiality. And the other thing is privilege, which is the right to withhold certain communications or information from disclosure and evidence. Now, it might have a common law or statutory basis. For one example, in Victoria, but not all states in Australia, the relationship between a penitent and a minister of religion is privileged. So you can confess to a Catholic priest, and that's privilege. And limited privilege may also apply to some professional relationships. So in Victoria, the patient-medical practitioner relationship is generally considered privileged.
So she was a lay psychotherapist, a lot of experience, but no formal education. Would it have been different if she was a psychiatrist?
If she was a physician psychiatrist, that would be considered privileged.
Really?
But the court's view was that the relationship between a client and psychotherapist generally is not privileged, unless a psychiatrist is working in one of the few specified areas in which privilege is conferred by statute. The psychologist-client relationship is not privileged.
So the court dismissed that, and the consensus was that the evidence was appropriate.
Right. Okay. So the summary of this is that the court clearly indicated that psychotherapist-client confidentiality is subordinate to public interest, and that there is no legal duty requiring a psychotherapist to maintain the confidentiality of information disclosed by a client which relates to the investigation of a serious crime and or the protection of public safety. Then additionally, the court stated there is no general common law or statutory privilege which applies to communications between a client and their psychotherapist. Finally, although not essential to the case before the court, the judge noted that there was an emerging view that a duty exists to disclose information to protect an endangered third party. They slapped her down, or slapped the defense down, didn't they?
They did. Well, I mean, this is an extreme circumstance.
Yeah. I think reading the decision and looking at the records, that if she had been a physician who was seeing him in a therapeutic relationship, that would be confidential and privileged.
Even if he said that he killed someone?
Yes, because,
wow.
Well, they say, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There's an emerging view.
Okay. That's interesting. And we should compare that to what it's looked like in the United States. I'm sure there are similar cases.
There are.
Yeah. So during his trial, he did admit his guilt. He said that he had choked Sheree, and he was convicted of kidnapping and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus 15 years without parole. Now, after he was sent to prison, though, for murdering Sheree, he said that he was innocent. In August of 2014, so fairly recently, he wrote that he believed law enforcement was using him as a scapegoat because of their failure to find those who were responsible for this crime. The police and the family of the victim, of course, did not believe this, and they were sickened that he did that. Sheree's grandfather told the local news anchor that Lowe was clearly guilty. He said the low-life coward must be forgetting he retraced the murderous steps with the psychoanalyst. He was filmed by police from the point of the abduction to where he placed Sheree's body. He said, "Go straight to hell, Robert Lowe." He said he should have been hanged. So now Robert Lowe is 79 years old, in prison. And he's going to die in prison. Sheree's family says that day just can't come soon enough for them.
You know, the therapist Margaret Hobbs began writing a book based on her experience with Robert. She died in a vehicle accident in 1996, and her book was later completed and published by Andrew Rule.
Yeah, we read a different book about Sheree called The Murder of Sheree by Wayne Miller. Very detailed book. I'm going to admit I couldn't read the whole thing. I only had a week.
There's a lot of words in there.
A lot of words to read, that's right. Too many words for my eyes, but if you're interested in learning more about this case, it is a well-written, informative book. It just would take more time than I have. I think you read pretty thoroughly.
We hit the high points.
Yes. Before we get to feedback, I'd like to do a little self-promoting and Tie Grabber housekeeping. Tie Grabber members, as you know, are our primary support, and we consistently release a members-only episode at least once a month as the perfect cure for an affliction that we've talked about before, and this affliction is hypoepisodemia. Now, we recently released an episode about Robert Fisher, who's been on the run. You can join Tie Grabber for $3 or $5 a month on our website, tiegrabber.com. That's TIEGRABBER.com. Our members receive TCB gifts, too. So if you're interested in that, sign up at tiegrabber.com or support us on Patreon, and you can hear the premium episodes there as one of our patrons. We also have a second podcast called Watching ID, where we watch a show on the Investigation Discovery Network, and then we chat about it. And we're going to be putting out a new episode each week in March and hopefully April. We're covering Season 5 of A Crime to Remember. Episode 1 is available for you to listen to now. You can also support the podcast by making a purchase through the Shop the Brewery page on our website, or giving us a positive review on iTunes or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. The reviews help a lot, helping us to get new listeners for the show. Another way to help out is just by word of mouth. If you know someone who might enjoy our shows, please tell them about us. Another reminder that CrimeCon is coming in May, coming soon now, in Nashville, and we're going to have a table on Podcast Row for the first time. So we're very excited about this, also a little bit nervous. I hope some of our listeners will come and keep us company there. Dick's got plans for us to go out and do some pub crawls. Right, Dick?
We have some good plans. I've got a bunch of places that have been recommended. And we're always looking for other places. So if you have any recommendations for the Nashville beer scene, give us a call.
Yeah.
Or drop us a line or something.
We'd love to have a beer with a few listeners. Now, our promo code, if you want to get 10% off of your CrimeCon admission, is TC Brewery. That's TCBREWERY, crimecon.com. Please write in also to share your ideas and opinions with us for feedback on future episodes. You can also share opinions and experiences on our True Crime Brewery fan discussions page on Facebook. We have over 900 members now, so I'm really hoping to get to the 1,000 mark. And there's really some great stuff to share there. A lot of people share interesting cases. All right, let's do the feedback. It's a short feedback day.
Yes, it is. But let's do it. We got a couple anyway.
Yeah. Okay, our first bit of feedback is a voicemail. So let's hear it.
Hello, my name's Dan, and I'm a new but ardent fan. Just wanted to suggest perhaps you guys taking a look at Ronald Simmons back in 1987, December 1987. It was a killing spree. Pretty interesting case, and just thought I'd suggest it. Maybe you'll take the time to do it. If not, no biggie. I'll still listen. That's about it. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we looked up Ronald Jaden Simmons. He's an American spree killer, killing 16 people over a week-long period in Arkansas in 1987. He was a retired military serviceman, murdered 14 members of his own family, including a daughter he had sexually abused and the child he had fathered with her. He killed a former co-worker, a stranger, and he wounded 4 others. He was sentenced to death 16 times, and after refusing to appeal his sentence, he was executed in Arkansas in 1990. So shortly before Christmas of 1987, he apparently decided to kill all the members of his family.
So up until then, was he a normal guy, or we don't know?
No, he wasn't. He'd been having problems. He was in the service. He retired from the military in 1979. They were living in Arkansas on a tract of land that was 2 old modeled mobile homes joined together to form one large home, no telephone, no indoor plumbing, and surrounded by a privacy fence. So he's
got a compound going on there.
Kind of like that.
Yeah.
And he was being investigated by New Mexico Social Services for allegations that he had been sexually abusing his 17-year-old daughter and had fathered a child with her. He fled New Mexico and ended up in Dover, Arkansas, on his land. So there's something screwed up.
A lot screwed up.
Right. Before Christmas in 1987, he decided to kill all the family members. On the morning of December 22nd, he first killed his wife, Rebecca, and his oldest son, Gene, by shooting them with a pistol. And then he killed his 3-year-old granddaughter, Barbara, by strangling her.
And they think that was his daughter? Or is that a different child?
No, that's the sexually abused daughter's child. It was his. And he dumped the bodies in a cesspit that he had made his children dig. Then he waited for his other children to return home, and after their arrival, he told them he had presents for them.
Oh my
But
God.
he wanted to give them the presents one at a time.
This is just horrible.
So he first killed his daughter, 17-year-old Loretta. He strangled her and held her under the water in a rain barrel.
Oh.
The other 3 children, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky, were killed the same way. Then on December 26th, the remaining members of the family arrived for their Christmas visit. The first to be killed was his son Billy and Billy's wife Renata. They were shot. He then strangled and drowned their 20-month-old son, Trey. Then he shot and killed his oldest daughter, Sheila, whom he had sexually abused, and her husband, Dennis McNulty.
Wow, that is like hell.
Oh, and then he strangled his child by Sheila. And finally, his 21-month-old grandson, Michael. He laid the bodies of his whole family in neat rows in the lounge. All the corpses were covered with coats except that of Sheila, who was covered by Rebecca Simmons' best tablecloth. The bodies of the 2 grandsons were wrapped in plastic sheeting and left in abandoned cars at the end of the lane. So after completing all the murders, he went for a drink at a local bar, then returned to the house, and apparently oblivious to the corpses lined up around him, spent the rest of the evening and following day drinking beer and watching television. 2 days later, he drove into Russellville, walked into a law office, and killed a receptionist who he had previously been infatuated with, but who had rejected him. Then he went next door to an oil company office and shot a man named J.D. Chaffin dead and wounded the owner. He then drove to a convenience store where he used to work. He shot and wounded 2 more people. And then he went to the office of the Woodline Motor Freight Company, also a place where he had worked, where he shot and wounded a woman. Then he simply sat in the office while waiting for the police. When they arrived, he handed over his gun and surrendered without resistance.
How is it we don't know about this? This sounds like a crazy, huge crime.
I don't know, it's 30 years old. Maybe it's lost some of its notoriety. But that'd be something to delve into, I think.
I think so. I mean, there must be some mental illness.
You think?
I think so. Jesus. But that's just a horror show. That's like worse than a horror movie.
It is.
I mean, thanks for your suggestion, Dan, but wow. Overwhelming. So I just have one more case suggestion I'm going to read today. It's from Crystal. I want to say I love the podcast and to ask if you've read or talked about Rodney Reed. It's a case in Bastrop, Texas. Sorry if you have already. I haven't listened to all of your podcasts. No, we haven't. Now, Rodney Reed was convicted of the murder of Stacy Stites and is currently on death row. He's been fighting for a new trial due to some new evidence and the fact that Stacy's fiancé at the time is now also in prison for rape, which casts doubt on his own guilt. However, if you actually read into Rodney's own history, it makes you see why he was convicted in the first place. Being in Austin, it's one I hear about frequently and is very conversational and would love to hear y'all's take on it, especially considering a person's life is on the line. Unlike other states, we tend to actually kill our death row inmates. That's true.
Yeah.
I know there is an A&E show called Dead Again that had a 2-part episode about him called Dead Man Talking, and I heard that it's going to be on HLN's Death Row Stories, an episode called Love Kills on April 1st. So we'll have to make a note of that. She says, thanks for keeping me distracted while working. So hopefully being distracted at her job is okay. Some jobs you don't want to be distracted. So I looked into Rodney Reed just a little bit, and there are appeals taking place. Now, the interesting thing I thought was the fiancé.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this guy's convicted. It looks like the evidence was semen matched to Rodney Reed and some circumstantial evidence which is in question. Now, in 2008, Stacy's fiancé, Jimmy Fennell, who was a policeman? Yeah, he was a police officer. He didn't have the help of fellow officers, so he pled guilty to kidnapping and sexual misconduct in an unrelated incident in 2007. So this was an incident when he was on duty. He pulled over the victim for a traffic stop and handcuffed her and put her in the back seat of his patrol car, where he assaulted her. He was originally charged with raping her, but pled guilty to a lesser charge. The victim in that case has spoken out against Officer Jimmy Fennell and questions Reed's guilt. Bryce Benjet of the Innocence Project is currently Reed's attorney. He presented new evidence during Reed's writ of habeas corpus hearing that started on October 18th of 2017 and lasted for 4 days. Benjet presented an interview with Fennell's best friend, Curtis Davis, who is a county sheriff's investigator. The interview is from the TV show Death Row Stories and was videotaped in 2016. He also stated the same things in an interview on CNN. Davis's interviews completely contradicted Fennell's alibi that he was at home with Stites on April 22, 1996. According to Davis, Fennell told him on April 23, 1996, before Stites' body was found, but after she was known to be missing, that he'd been out drinking with several other police officers and gotten home late, likely 10 or 11 p.m. after his fiancée had already gone to bed. Reed's legal team also submitted substantial forensic evidence showing that Stites was murdered hours before the state believes she was, and also that her body had been moved after her death and placed where she was found. So this is an interesting case. It's got conspiracy, police officers, and there's also a racial component because Reed is African American, and the other suspect or fiancé and Stacy were Caucasian.
Well,
So
I always love cases where there's ambiguity.
And we haven't covered a lot of false convictions or possible false convictions.
No, not that many.
No.
We have done some.
We have done some, but usually people tell us they're not false convictions when we say they might be false. That's been, Scott Peterson. Michael Peterson, we thought, shouldn't have been convicted.
Right.
We took a lot of grief for that.
The Rafe murders.
And then
That's
recently
the most
the
recent
Rafe.
one.
Yeah. But, yeah, I would definitely want to look into this one as well. Very interesting. It has a lot of court things you can look over. It's just a wealth of information and conversation, like she said. So I'm going to put that in the to-do pile, along with the crazy man who killed all those family members.
He was a prolific murderer.
But only for a weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of Philip Markoff only did it for a weekend.
And as I said, it's a spree killer.
Yeah, so different from a serial killer or a mass killer.
Yes. So let's
a new
keep these
thing.
in mind.
Okay. They're going to go right in the to-do pile. And
Okay.
that's all we're going to do today because I have a plane to catch.
That's right. You're
right.
leaving me.
I'm leaving you for a few days.
That's right. Just for a few.
Yeah, I'll be back.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody, and keep the feedback coming. We'll do probably a lot more next week.
So we'll see you at the quiet end, guys and girls.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.